Just before we start, a little announcement. We aren't a news podcast, but I'm afraid events have somewhat overtaken us, with the same group of researchers making a new discovery this week. I will interject at the point where that becomes important.
Hello, I'm Katie Steckles.
And I'm Peter Rowlett. Hi Katie, what's today's mathematical object?
Well, today's mathematical object is the absolutely fresh, newly recently discovered aperiodic monotile, which everyone is incredibly excited about. And as you know, I know some stuff about this, but I feel like I'm not necessarily completely qualified to talk about this. So I've brought along a special guest to kind of share a little bit of the story behind this. Please welcome Chaim.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
It's absolutely fantastic to chat to you. So you're literally currently at the MoMath in New York as well.
That's right.
This is like the most mathematical episode of this podcast we've done. So yeah, this is like the big news on the internet. So our website where we host this podcast is the Aperiodical, and we felt it was our true responsibility to cover this news. This is probably the most aperiodical news we could possibly have.
It's a very simple, pun that it is a periodical, but it's aperiodical, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
But the coincidence of that aligning with this news is just brilliant. So.
Yeah.
I see. It's a little disappointing. I thought that the emphasis was on that topic.
Just an entire blog about tilings with we've been running it for over 10 years now, I think, and this has been the first kind of proper aperiodicity news that we've been able to cover. So it's very exciting. But I think, because I guess there's a lot of subtlety in the kind of the definition of aperiodic, right? It's not quite... a lot of people use the words non-periodic and aperiodic sort of interchangeably, but there's a bit more to it, isn't there?
There really is. So we're talking about how to form tilings from copies of a set of tiles, right? So we might have a few shapes, and then we want to replicate these shapes, and we want them to fit together across the entire infinite plane without gaps or overlaps. And so, of course, squares fitting together is one kind of an example. And we talk about the tilings that a squares can admit or form, and that, obviously is the regular checkerboard, or regular grid, but also we might have things where we could slide a row of squares over or something like that. And we could have tilings that are periodic, that have sort of a replicating pattern that really is replicating in a pretty rigid way, that if we slide the whole pattern over, everything would line up.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of like people think of kind of a periodicness as being some kind of symmetry, but it's a very specific translation symmetry, I guess. Like the thing that always amuses me, that you can produce a tiling that doesn't have periodicity by taking something like a tiling of squares and then just cutting one of the squares in half. And then there's just one in the middle, and you can't then translate that at all and get the same thing. So it's...
That's true. But there's also the idea that you could take... So that's cut in half squares... can also tile non-periodically the whole plane. So you could take like all those squares and just cut them vertically or horizontally at random, and you'd have these 2x1 little rectangles that can fit together. They can form periodic tilings. They can also form non-periodic ones. Your generic tiling by them is just going to be a total mess. So that's not so interesting. What's amazing, and I really mean this. I learned about this when I was about 14, and I'm 40 years later, and I still really genuinely think this is amazing. So that there could be shapes that, when they fit together to form tilings, can only form these non-periodic, non-repeating patterns. They kind of repeat in a sense. You see the same sort of thing over and over again, but it doesn't repeat in this more rigid sense, as you said, with a translational symmetry where you could slide everything over and have it line up.
I think it's really, and it's very subtle, and Katie sent me a set of these. Katie, you've got a friend who's with a laser cutter, basically. Yep. So I've got this set of 30 of them. My son is 7, and I was trying to explain to him. I said, you can tile on, you can just keep going forever, and you never repeat. And he said, I think they've got it wrong, because I've put these two together the same way as those two over there. It's like, no, it's not quite as simple as that.
The instincts, because I've played with these, we took them down to Maths Jam, which is our maths night in the pub, and the first instinct of everyone who was playing with them was to try and make a regular pattern. It's just so tempting. But you start, and then you get to a point where you're like, nothing fits in there, so I have to remove that one, they have to remove that one, and then kind of put it back together. But yeah, so it's I guess aperiodic is kind of forced non-periodicity.
Absolutely.
So this is something that you learned about when you were 14, like how did that happen?
Well, of course, from the great Martin Gardner, so many of us learned so much, right?
Yep.
I mean, we're all sort of descendants of that. And, this podcast is part of his legacy, I think, really. He was, if any of your listeners have no idea somehow who he was, of course, he was the great mathematical communicator who brought so many of us to so many wonderful gems. And so I was reading, some old Scientific American Martin Gardner mathematical games columns while I was having to take some quiet time at school, as you might imagine. I was a little bit of a smart mouth, and luckily I had some Martin Gardner columns to keep me company for a while. And so and I remember very distinctly reading about, the phenomenon of aperiodic tiles. So he wrote, of course, about the Penrose tiles, which were discovered by Roger Penrose throughout the 70s, really. And I think anybody that really knows, who's been exposed to this, was probably exposed through the Penrose tiles and ultimately through Martin Gardner's writing about them. So these are, of course, 2 tiles. Well, really, there's more than one kind of Penrose tiles.
Yeah, I recently read up on these. Like, the original set was like 6 tiles, and then they kind of stripped it down, and then there's more than one kind of 2-tile set, and there's some other stuff as well. But it's, I guess, you try different things, right? You see what works.
Right, well, It's amazing that he was able to boil this down. So let me just say that, so there were 2 pairs. There's a pair of rhombuses with special marked edges, and they can be modified into actual shapes. So like chickens and geese is a very nice pair. So these 2 rhombuses, and then also this other pair called the kite and darts. And either of those pairs have this amazing property that they can form these tilings where they have copies fitted together, but never without repeating in this way we talked about. But incredibly, they always have these beautiful 5-fold rosettes on top of everything else. You somehow have pentagons on top of pentagons on larger and larger pentagons still, ad infinitum, and that's the source of the non-periodicity. It's really absolutely gorgeous. Yeah. But as you say, part of the game was to get it from 6 to 2. I mean, that's a miracle. There's no explanation for it. It's just...
Yeah. I mean, I think people may have seen pictures of Penrose tilings, and they often show it as just like the rhombuses, kind of plain rhombuses. But as a set of tiles, like just those 2 rhombuses aren't necessarily aperiodic, right? They can be used to make a periodic tiling. The kite and dart, I think if you put a kite in the back of the dart, you're not like that will just give you a periodic tiling of rhombuses. So like there are, I guess you described it as kind of modifications to the edges, but they're kind of matching rules as to how you're allowed to assemble them. And I guess you can do a thing where you take a chunk out of one and stick it on the side of the other and kind of create a thing which is kind of forcing that matching.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. And thank you for making that point, because that's really the whole heart of it. And I think lots of people miss that entirely, and it's like, well, what's the big deal? The rhombuses can do stupid stuff. They can do great stuff, they can do stupid stuff, but the miracle is the markings, the matching rules, which can be encoded in a variety of ways.
Yeah, and I guess this is that subtlety between non-periodic and aperiodic, because non-periodic is a property of the tiling, but aperiodic is a property of the tile, or the tiles that you're using.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's sort of the drum I've been beating for 30 years, so thank you for getting that right.
Yeah, I've seen discussion about it, and I think someone had like a canonical source of someone has used these 2 definitions this way, and it makes so much sense because they are distinct concepts, I guess.
That's right. In the honestly, so Martin Gardner himself was a little casual about the difference, and it took a while. He certainly was right about the definition, but the way he was using the terms sort of more interchangeably. It just takes a while for people to see the need to really make the difference. That's kind of what happened.
But it is that, because I think aperiodic is a good word for it, because it implies like the absence of periodicity, like you can't be periodic.
Yeah.
And I guess with the Penrose tiles, assuming that you match them up in the right kinds of ways, or you've got some way of forcing that, there's no way to build a periodic tiling with them. But I guess up until potentially quite recently, that was like the smallest known set. Right, 2 tiles was the best anyone had done. Although actually that's not strictly true, is it? There was a single tile that did have that property, but it was like a thing with a bit over there that's not even attached to it that's counted as part of the tile.
Oh, yes. So what you've just done is open up this whole kind of chasm of like, what do we mean by this? Like it's all this kind of hair splitting, and it's really important though. I mean, sort of a part of my career has been basically teasing out like, okay, what do we mean by this or that, right? So what do we mean by the smallest? Well, there's like a long answer there. What do we mean by what's a legitimate single tile or not? And there's answers there. And actually, there are other examples too. There was a single tile recently, a single hexagon that is tiles only aperiodically, but it doesn't. But the matching rules can't be encoded as by a shape. It's a little bit more complicated of a matching rule. And so, does that count? Well, I don't know. It doesn't not exactly not count. It's just that here we feel like we're closer to being able to say, well, yeah, this counts for sure. I mean, there's still a question of that, which is whether or not it really counts, whether it's a reflected. You have the shape and you allow its reflections as well.
Yeah, so this is the new discovery, right? This is the tile that's been discovered, which I think, given those kind of different categories we've just been discussing, it's a single tile. It's not a kind of complicated, messy shape that's made out of separate pieces attached together that counts as one tile, and you don't need matching rules, right? Just the actual shape of the piece itself forces aperiodicity. So tell us about that. Where did that come from? What happened?
So this is fantastic. I mean, this is the kind of thing that happens in this subject, and kind of perhaps uniquely, that people from outside the professional mathematical community have often made really profound discoveries, and often because they're doing it for their own passion and interest, and dedicating lots and lots of time to just doing the kind of work that isn't necessarily going to pay off, right? And so we have lots of examples of this, and in tiling. And so in the community, we started a tiling listserv that was really, the intention was to have this meeting place where, for lack of a better word, hobbyists or enthusiasts could have a place where we would all interact, and including professional mathematicians who happen to be hobbyists and enthusiasts too. And so, and then out of this, and so that was kind of the meeting ground. So Dave Smith is a member of that community and does all kinds of fantastic stuff and has come up with many really cool examples. And up he pops with this thing. And it was a guided search. I mean, he really had an intention. He knew he had sort of had a particular field. Like if you imagine you're sort of walking around looking for some diamond in the dirt or something, right? He had some idea of where to look. And yet these things nobody really knows, but they seem to be colossally rare. I mean, it was really also great fortune that this thing exists in the first place. So there it is, pop, this amazing little, immediately he saw it behaving in strange and unexpected ways, and so then that merited further investigation. He called in the mathematicians.
Yeah, well, because this is the thing, right? If you've got a shape, finding a shape, but proving it has that property is actually a lot more work, I guess, than kind of seeing a thing which appears to have this behavior, because you need it to be a proof, right? Yeah,
I mean, it's work either way, but yeah. Well, first of all, you have to find structure then, right? After you have the tile, then what kind of structure? Or even just, so he contacted Craig Kaplan, who had some software where he could enumerate like big patches. So just even being able to look at like a giant chunk of the tiling is important. And so that was with computer help. It's important because that way you can begin to see patterns and maybe deduce what some of the structure might be. And so Craig found a lot of stuff. But it still wasn't proven, so they contacted me. And frankly, I just started my job here and was quite busy. And my main advice at the time was just to contact Joseph Myers. Then, for better or worse, that might not have been good advice for myself in the sense of wanting to do more on the project, and that Joseph just immediately cleans the whole thing out within like 2 days. So Joseph is an extraordinary mathematician, and so he pretty much finished it off. So then, yeah, I got to play the role of, expert in the field and helping to describe what it is and put it in context and work on the paper in that way. But really, those are the three that discovered it and found the proof. I mean, I hope I did some more than that, but I'm not sure. Honestly, they really did a fantastic job. So,
I mean, yet again, this is the beauty of collaboration in maths, right? Everything is a joint effort when it comes down to it, and this is a really nice example of something where someone found a thing and then someone else did. It's just wonderful. I mean, like obviously we're on a podcast, so trying to describe what a shape looks like is probably a futile exercise. There will be a picture associated with this episode which will show you what this shape looks like. But the thing that gets me about it is it's literally just some bits of a hexagon, right? Like if you imagine a hexagon. I guess the traditional way to split a hexagon up into 6 pieces would be into triangles, but there's a different way of doing it, which is kind of at 60 degrees from that, where you split it up into kites. I guess if anyone's following along, you can picture that. And this tile is literally just sort of, is it 7 or 8 of those kites just stuck together into a piece?
Or maybe I would describe it a little bit even more coarsely, that if you take a hexagon and you chop it into thirds, but instead of chopping it to the corners, you chop it to the middle of the sides. You get some weird third, and it's 4 of those.
Yeah.
It's just 4 of those,
Right.
which is crazy because it's like friends of mine have been reminding me that they've asked me in the past, "What do you think, Chaim? Is there an aperiodic monotile?" And I would give some sort of stammering answer, like, well, I'm not going to commit necessarily, but I did in my heart believe that there was such a thing. But I also would have absolutely believed that it was going to be some kind of crazy, complicated gadget that can fit together in some sort of weird slotting together, some absolutely bizarre way. So it's just way, way simpler than I think any of us really. And plus the ground had been kind of picked over. So Joseph Myers, one reason why, a primary reason it was really natural to contact him was that he had explored families of similar kinds of things. Like, okay, if you take tiles that are made out of hexagons, how complicated can that be? And he searched all the tiles that are made out of hexagons out to like some number of hexagons. And they're very, very rare. There are very few interesting things, but he did find some very special things, but not this special. And he did this in a number of categories, and several other people did as well, including Craig. And so this ground had been, I was describing it as a field that you're kind of walking around looking for some diamond in the dust, right? And like that field had been explored, and that one had been explored, and that one, and that one. And somehow Dave had just realized there was another one close at hand that nobody had looked in, and there it was. So
when you're exploring fields, what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about a computer search? Is that what's happening? Are people?
Yeah, so I mean by a field like just all the possible tiles made out of hexagons, right? You start at the edge where here's one with 1 hexagon, and I understand that one pretty well, and 2 hexagons, or 3 maybe I could work out by hand very quickly, really, but by the time you get to 7 or 8, just listing them out's a problem, and then much less what they can do, all the possible ways they can fit together. And so, these are typically massive searches very quickly, and for all kinds of reasons, these are provably intractable searches as well. So I guess that's really the most exciting and interesting thing to me, truly, is that this is really connected to the theory of computation and all kinds of foundational things there, and that includes why it's ultimately futile to do these searches in some fundamental way. So,
could you talk to us about the proof? How do you prove something like this? Could you sort of outline the strategy?
Yeah, so that's a really big deal because you're making a claim about the way tiles are across, not just next to each other, but foot apart, or claiming there's no translational symmetry is saying that, okay, if I move the whole tiling over by a foot, something's not going to line up. If I move it over by a mile, something's not going to line up, or a light year, or beyond the scale of the universe, right? So it's hard to see perhaps how a finite proof could somehow encapsulate structure at all scales. And honestly, there have only been really a handful or less of really truly distinct methods in the plane. So the first is from the 1960s, and it includes Penrose's examples and pretty much most of the examples. And my career pretty much has been spent exploring this idea that you could have tiles that fit like the Penrose tiles. They fit together essentially to form larger copies of themselves. And then those tiles fit together in turn. They have to, because they have the same kind of markings somehow scaled up. That those in turn can only fit together to make larger copies of themselves ad infinitum. And because any given tile is in this hierarchy of larger and larger and larger and larger copies of itself, essentially. And moreover, in one way, that means that you could never, no matter what size sliding you have, there's some sort of giant tile bigger than that would be slid on top of itself. A contradiction, ergo, doesn't happen. And so this, as I said, that's been done now for 60 years in various kinds of ways, and this tile has that proof within it. It's part of what the proof is. But then just out of the blue, Joseph, being, I guess, who he is, actually saw a different and distinct proof, which is actually really, as I said, I mean, it's more exciting to me in some ways than the hat tile itself, because as I said, we only have a handful of different ways of going about this, really. And now we have a whole new one. I mean, a whole new idea of way to show aperiodicity. It's a whole second different proof, and a brand new proof inside of the paper. So that's pretty cool. It's harder to explain, though. I can try.
Much like always being collaborative, maths has always got more than one way to do anything, which is another of my favourite things about maths. So it's great that this is something that's a really nice example of that, but it also means, potentially that second method could be then used to look at other stuff as well. That's incredible. Yeah. So you've briefly referred to it as the hat tile there, and this is one of the kind of many nicknames that it's got going around. So it's been called the Einstein tile and the hat tile, and then various people have pointed out that it looks less like a hat and more like a T-shirt. And I think we also ended up with a diagram on our site of it with it as a hat and a T-shirt and a pair of trousers. If you sat down, I guess. It's kind of it's one of those shapes you can read a lot of things into. But so the name Einstein, I guess everyone's calling this a pun, because it's one tile, so it's Einstein in German, I guess, but it has nothing to do with Albert Einstein.
So I take no responsibility for any of the above at all. So the term Einstein is from a German-speaking mathematician, so I guess he gets some rights there, named Ludwig Donzer, who popularized the term in the 1990s as a way, obviously, to promote the question, right? I understand it means one shape or one tile.
One stone.
It bothers me enormously because there are so many things in mathematics that are named after the wrong person already without bringing in things.
Well, I thought it was a little corny or fishy in the first place, even then. But whatever, and it certainly worked, my goodness.
Are we allowed to call it the aperiodic monotile? Because presumably it won't necessarily always be the only aperiodic monotile. But
yeah, that's right.
I don't know. But it already isn't, right? So there's the hat, and then there's also the turtle.
Right. So actually, it's not quite. So the whole thing about it is that, first of all, what we mean by the whole question of whether the problem had been solved previously is all depending on our definitions, right? Including does 1 equal 2, I suppose. But whether a tile could be connected or just... And so this, I think, really, I feel, definitely is an Einstein, and the problem has been solved. But we also can fully expect that this just points to the subtlety of what a single tile can do. And I would be astonished, truly, if this is the end of the story.
Well, yeah, I mean, you touched on the fact that, because the first question that we got when we posted about this, in the comments underneath, there was already someone, and it's lovely that it's sort of a question that occurs to people, even if they don't necessarily know all the stuff behind it, was like, oh, how come some of these are flipped? Because surely it should just be able to tile on its own. So this is a tile which, in order to get this aperiodicity, you tile it, but I think it's like 1 in 6 tiles is mirrored.
It's actually 1 over the golden ratio to the 4th power, isn't that cute?
Well, obviously, excellent. But that satisfies a mathematical definition of congruence, but it doesn't necessarily look like, if you were tiling your bathroom, you would need to have 2 different types of tile because the back would be not shiny. So, if we're all talking about tilings, we're definitely thinking about bathroom walls. But, is that maybe the next step to kind of find one that also has that property, that it's always just the same orientation?
Absolutely. The hunt is certainly on, isn't it? I mean, it's the obvious question. And of course, just to defend it, saying that it is a single tile, we're relying on the tiling literature itself. So I think really it has to be seen as a cultural question. What counts? What's a tile? What's a shape? And what's this and that? And so within that, we're sticking with it being a single tile. But naturally the question is, okay, what if we don't allow it to flip over? For sure.
So here's the point where I need to interject from the future. We spoke to Chaim about a month ago, and I had the episode edited, and I told him I'm going to release it next Friday, and then he replied and said, there's some other news that might come out next week that you might want to incorporate. But of course he didn't say what. And the new news is that the same team have made this new discovery. So the hat and the turtle satisfy the mathematical question that was called the search for the Einstein tile. But what Chaim calls here the obvious question about whether you can do it using a tile that doesn't require reflections has already been answered, because the same team have found this new tile called the spectre, and it's a tile from the same family as the hat, but what's special is that it tiles the plane with just rotations and translations of the tile. There are no reflections needed. Anyway, I'll send you back to April when we didn't know this. It's definitely one of those really nice things in mathematics of kind of what game do you want to play, because they're both perfectly good games, aren't they? You can play the game where you can flip it over, you can play the game where you can't flip it over, you can try and solve either problem.
And we saw a whole string of intermediate, successive problems that people could solve for the last 30 years or more.
Yeah, I'm determined to find an aperiodic tiling where just one of the tiles is the other way around and all of the rest of them.
That's interesting. You can actually prove that if you had such a thing, then you would be able to do it without that single tile. Because what you do is just sort of shove that tile off to infinity in a certain sense. You can take larger and larger regions that don't have that tile, and therefore you can actually construct a tile.
So it has to be, I guess, like a fraction of the total tiling rather than a finite number of tiles.
Something like that.
That's the other way around.
Yeah. Otherwise, you could take an arbitrarily large area up to infinity.
That's exactly right.
Excellent. I like that. Cool.
So our friend Christian wrote a post about this on the website, and Katie and I sort of helped him tidy it up. But that got this really good reaction. It got a lot of people talking in the comments. But what's the broader reaction been like?
Fortunately, I'm not on social media, so this is all hearsay to me. But I gather that it has had quite an impact. From the snippets that I've seen, though, I mean, people, of course, my friends, and I see the incredible variety of ways that people have taken this and made it their own. And I think that what could be more gratifying than that? Just to even have any, regardless of any personal involvement. I mean, just on the level of that, this is a question and an area that I've thought about for decades. And to see that millions of people are interested in it enough to turn it into something that they've put their own creativity and energy and thought into, and then presumably will tell it to other people and show it to their kids and down the line. I mean, I think Dave's discovery, and let's attribute to him in this context for sure. Dave has discovered something that has the most chance of living culturally for a very, very long time than anything else I've ever been in direct contact with, I think. I mean, it's the sort of thing that just simply will be present, and people are seizing upon it and making sure that happens. So, like, I've seen, I'm sure you've all seen, of course, all the maker files and the laser cut, but then also the tray of hat-shaped cookies and the quilts and astonishing things.
Obviously, like, our views on this are skewed by the fact that we hang around with maths people, so we're seeing a lot more of this than I guess the general population is necessarily hooked into. But it is incredible, like, the response of people. I think it's sort of, I want to say it's a pretty tiling, like it's an attractive tiling, but I'm not sure whether that is like a kind of visual attractiveness, because it's sort of quite kind of angly and clunky and awkward. But the notion of it, like the concept behind this, is such an elegant, beautiful thing that it's really kind of captured people's imaginations in that sense. And yeah, people want it, on a T-shirt or on a cookie cutter or a key ring or whatever. It's just lovely.
Perhaps it's the simplicity too. It's as you say, I guess that's the elegance, right? That this one little gadget. I mean, I guess that's the theory of computation angle that I find most compelling here. Is that so? In general, the case that has been made now for decades by many people, but still hasn't really sunk in somehow very, very broadly, is that very small gadgets can give rise immediately to fully complex behavior. In particular, very small gadgets. And by this I might mean like letters on a page, or the way atoms can fit together, or the way tiles might fit together in copies, or computer and little tiny computer words like for and if, and that these little kind of combinatorial gadgets very quickly give rise to utterly irreducible, fully computationally complex behavior. That is to say, it can basically emulate any computer program whatsoever in a fundamental way. And this happens immediately, very, very quickly. And here we have an example of this small, I'm not saying that we know that a single tile can emulate arbitrary computation, but we do know that 5 tiles suffices. And so the question is, and we clearly see that a single tile can already do pretty crazy stuff. And I think on some level people are responding to that, right? Here's this one little guy, and my goodness,
Yeah, and there's also something quite inspirational about the idea that this was discovered by someone who isn't a research mathematician in an ivory tower somewhere, thinking of stuff. This was just someone who found this interesting enough to play with it, who kind of came up with this thing, and then also got hooked into kind of collaboration to make it into a proper piece of published research. Actually, that's just reminded me in terms of impact. You'll appreciate this. So the day after the discovery was Matt Parker, who's a maths communicator, was receiving an award at the Royal Society, and he'd written a talk for that which was called Every Interesting Bit of Maths Ever, which I think was an exaggeration, but he had an hour, and he managed to fit quite a lot of stuff in there. But the first thing he said was, I can't believe I wrote, I'd already finished writing this talk, and then suddenly someone's discovered a new bit of interesting maths since I finished writing the talk. So we did like a good 5 minutes at the start about this new monotile, and it was really nice, really kind of well-researched, accurate bit. And he was like, this is the speed of research these days, that something could be a preprint on the archive one day and then presented at the Royal Society the following day.
Right. It's not by carrier pigeon or something. It doesn't take.
Yeah, but it was lovely. And there was already someone there who'd like drawn the tiling on the back of their outfit as like a decoration. It was like everyone was it was such a wonderful day. Like the vibe everywhere online and kind of even kind of meeting up with maths people, everyone was talking about it.
That's so great. Yeah, even from just as a professional mathematician, or even just somebody who's interested in mathematics, so whatever distance one wants from this, it's just great to have people enthusiastic about a mathematical idea, so broadly. It was mocked on Jimmy Kimmel. That was pretty amazing. Jimmy Kimmel being the late night talk show host. Actually, the hot tile wasn't mocked. Actually, he was clearly. Some of his writers were clearly enthusiastic. It was just mathematicians, so oh well. That's okay.
Can I ask where you are with peer review?
We submitted it, but peer review takes a while, and that's another crazy thing, right? Before the editor had a chance to open his email, it was being read at the Royal Society. So
Yeah, there's been like newspaper articles about it, and there's not a lot of maths things get into the mainstream press in the UK, and I imagine that's probably true elsewhere as well. But I think partly I think it's because David is from the UK. Is that right?
Certainly the UK angle plays pretty well, but really it's been all over the world. It's been great.
Yeah, well, I think it was also just the idea that they could say, local boy discovers,
for sure,
discovers new piece of maths. But yeah, it's sort of cool to see. This is a really nice write-up in the Times, actually. So the science editor of the Times is Tom Whipple, and we're sort of talking to him about some other stuff at the minute, and we happened to mention this, and he was like, yeah, it was really exciting to have something come along that was so easy to write about. Like it was something that I could actually explain in a national newspaper and not worry about it being too kind of out of reach for people, which I think is partly another reason why it's been so popular, is that it's actually something that, you've got it on your T-shirt or whatever, and someone can go, what's that? And you could literally explain it. And the article we did had a hand-waving dinner table explanation that people could take away and use if they wanted, of like what this thing is and how the proof was done.
And people would be right. As long as they get the word can only tile non-periodically. You just stick that one word in, people can understand it and be totally right. And honestly, let me be just really clear. This is exactly what has attracted me to this kind of mathematics, this area, since I was a kid. I think it's great how mathematics is so abstract and can lift off into these rarefied realms. But as a mathematician, I was always drawn to being able to, this kind of concrete style of mathematics. And it's not always the most favored by any means. But I feel it's clearly vindicated that it's important and interesting to pursue mathematics that you can touch. And I'd like to see more research mathematicians take heed, truly. And so here I am at the National Museum of Mathematics in New York City, MoMath, and I'm employed here as outreach mathematician. And I take that really seriously. And of course, none of us expected to get any international press right out the gate, truly. But, reach out. Any mathematicians listening to this, reach out, outreach. Your work doesn't have to be so out there that you can't explain it to anybody other than a few handful of people. And I hope that this inspires some younger mathematicians to take heed, for sure.
Yeah. Well, it's. I imagine there's maths clubs around the world where people are now playing with this, right? People are bringing along 3D printed and laser cut tiles and kind of playing with this. And
well, I mean something more than that. I mean that the style of mathematics that people will come practice. I hope that some people will be inclined to maybe do something a little more that they could explain to people, a little maybe more more concrete. It doesn't mean that it's any less deep, certainly.
If anything, it's kind of more deep to have something that's so, as you say, starts from such a small thing, but then produces this incredible complexity.
Yeah.
So if people are interested in you, they want to find more about what you're doing, where would they be looking for that?
Well, I'm at the Museum of Mathematics in New York all the time, for starters. Right now my web presence is a little bit in decline, so I hope to have my website up again at some point. But for the hat and the museum, we're going to have a hat design coloring contest or design, to really encourage people to show off the various ways that they've made the hat their own. But details of that aren't really ready. We'll have that forthcoming at momath.org and other places soon, and we'll let you know too. And then I guess at Oxford there's going to be a hat celebration in mid-July, and so I guess news of that will be going out all over. But all sorts of luminaries from the world of aperiodic tiling will be there, including, as I understand, Sir Roger Penrose himself. So I'm certainly looking forward to that. And there'll be some hat assembly, very much some public-facing, make some big hat tiles, put them together. So very much looking forward to that.
So both Peter and I are on Twitter and on Mastodon. I'm at Steckles.
I'm at Peter Rowlett. The podcast itself is at Maths Objects.
Both of us blog at aperiodical.com, the most appropriately named website for this particular topic, and that's where you can find more episodes of this podcast that are sadly not about aperiodic tilings.
And if you'd like to get in touch and tell us about your recent mathematical discovery or any other objects you suggest we might want to look at, you can do that by emailing objects@aperiodical.com.
The music is Funk Game Loop by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons.